Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. This is Jim Pickett with IRMA. Thank you so much for joining us today for Whose Choice Is It Anyway? I want to quickly point you to some other teleconferences we've recently done, updating the field on what's happening in terms of rectal microbicide research. Just a couple weeks ago on September 17th, we did a webinar teleconference called Swish or Insert Then Flirt, an update on rectal microbicides. And in June, we did a webinar / teleconference called Will Rectal Dreams Come True? Both of these slide sets and recordings are available on the IRMA website. If you go to rectalmicrobicides.org and click on teleconferences, you can access those materials. And the materials from today's teleconference, the slides and the recording, will be posted in this same place. And we'll let you know when that happens, but you can go ahead and check it out and be able to refer back to these slides or the recording at any time and also share it widely if you would like. I'd like to thank AVAC for helping us today, and in particular Levi for doing all the logistics, the call-outs, uploading the slides, all the things that make this run so smoothly. So thank you very, very much. And I also want to thank my co-presenters today, Marc-Andre LeBlanc, who's a secretary and co-founding member of IRMA. You know me, Jim Pickett, Intando Yola, Irene Huara, and Sinazo Peter from Africa, advocates from Sub-Saharan Africa, will also be joining us to comment in the second half of this webinar. We do encourage engagement. We have a chat box if you are online, so feel free to use that chat box. You can also send email questions to rectalmicro@gmail.com. That's rectalmicro@gmail.com. And while people don't seem to like to do this so much anymore, we will be opening up the call for verbal questions and answers or comments. Feel free to do it. No one bites here. And at that time, we'll remind you to unmute your phone and then remind you to remute your phone because, as I mentioned earlier, we are keeping this phone call on global mute, so we have a nice, clean recording that we can all enjoy over and over and over again. So with that said, Levi, if you could hit the next slide, please. So I wanted to go over some background for you today. We're going to go over some background. We're going to cover the findings. That's where Marc-Andre is going to pick up. We're going to hear from some community voices, and I mentioned those to you just moments ago, Intando, Irene, and Sinazo. There will be a conclusion, some ideas for taking action, and as I mentioned, I hopefully will have virtual discussion and live Q&A via the chat, via verbal, or via the email rectalmicro@gmail.com. So can we have the next slide? So IRMA, the International Rectal Microbicide Advocates, and our many partners and allies believe we need an array of HIV prevention options, and that the development of safe, effective, acceptable, and accessible vaginal and rectal microbicides remains an important priority. I would add desirable to that list. This includes multi-purpose technologies that can protect from HIV, in addition to other STIs and/or unwanted pregnancy. However, as most of you know, microbicides are under severe threat. Every 7 years, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NIAID, a component of the National Institutes of Health, NIH, revisits its HIV prevention and treatment research priorities and competitively renews its funding of the HIV clinical trial networks operating in the United States and all across the world. To help determine focus and priorities for the networks from 2021 through 2027, NIAID launched a request for input in early 2017 that it promised would be transparent and meaningful. After input was collected, NIAID presented its proposal for refining the HIV clinical research networks in early 2018 at a meeting of the AIDS Research Advisory Committee. The new proposal did not support the research and development of user-controlled, short-acting, non-systemic microbicide options, and focused solely on long-acting and systemic formulations, such as vaccines, injectables, and implants. They note they will support multi-purpose prevention products if they are presented with a highly efficacious product. However, if the level of efficacy must compete with a systemic product, the bar may be impossible to reach. Given that the U.S. government provides the lion's share of global funding for rectal and vaginal microbicide research, about 84% of global funding to be precise, according to AVAC's resource tracking information, these prevention research priorities will likely mean the end of the microbicides topical prevention field. Can I have the next slide, please? So what do we do about all this while the request for input was going on? So during the public comment period throughout 2017, IRMA developed and broadly circulated a statement emphasizing the need for prevention choices to meet the various needs of multiple vulnerable communities, and we sought endorsements and encouraged others to submit their own comments to NIAID. We also created an additional letter outlining the important role microbicides would play in cisgender and transgender women's ability to reduce HIV acquisition. That was also circulated by our partners, AIDS Foundation of Chicago, and AIDS Foundation of Chicago was actually the secretariat for IRMA. Ultimately, between these two broadly circulated letters, 306 organizations and 527 individuals from all parts of the world endorsed these two statements. And you can see these statements on the IRMA website or through the report that we are talking about today, Whose Choice Is It Anyway? You can see the URL there on the slide, tinyurl.com. Whose Choice Anyway is the URL. Sorry, tinyurl.com/Whose Choice Anyway. AIDS Foundation of Chicago also coordinated efforts to develop a congressional letter in the U.S. House of Representatives, led by Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, a longtime supporter of microbicide research. 18 members of Congress in the U.S. signed this letter strongly endorsing continued microbicide research and development. However, concerned with the lack of transparency surrounding the request for input, we asked and asked and asked, and we were not provided access to what the input looked like, and we felt like we were owed that because this is a publicly funded, taxpayer-funded network, and these sorts of processes are really supposed to be transparent. So since NIAID would not provide us what was given to them in terms of input, AIDS Foundation of Chicago filed a Freedom of Information Act request to obtain copies of all comments submitted during the input phase, as well as responses from NIAID to the input. The goal was to determine how NIAID's proposed U.S. taxpayer-funded plan reflected input received or not. We analyzed the 330 pages of comments received through the FOIA request, or the Freedom of Information Act request, as well as any additional missing content that we were able to trace. We did note that there was some content that were missing. These were things that we were actually directly involved in and did not come back to us through the FOIA, so we did follow up on the things that we knew about. So all of these submissions, all this paper represents about 120 unique submissions from advocates, researchers, academics, elected officials, research networks, and industry, mostly from the U.S. and, excuse me a second, my computer just went crazy, mostly from the U.S. and several African countries as well. And there were 56 responses from NIAID. And just to make sure things are clear, when we talked about the hundreds of people who signed on to the sign-on letters, that letter was considered one submission. So that letter actually, those letters each represented hundreds of people, hundreds of organizations. But in terms of the numbers of submissions, each of those letters was counted as one submission. So if we can go to the next slide that is titled What We Got. So we analyzed the 330 pages of comments received through the FOIA request, or the Freedom of Information Act request, as well as any of the additional missing content that we were able to trace and fold in. Again, this represents 120 unique submissions from advocates, researchers, academics, elected officials, and research networks, and I mentioned from multiple African countries, and 56 responses from NIAID. And with that said, I am going to turn the call over to Marc-Andre LeBlanc, who was the lead writer on this report, to take us through what actually was talked about, some more detail, what people were saying, and what we learned from our analysis of the FOIA request. So Marc-Andre, please unmute your phone by pressing *7 and take it away.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Great. So if you can go to the next slide, please. I want to start by noting that the vast majority of the submissions that Jim mentioned, in fact 79% of them, either expressed explicit support for microbicides by calling for continued microbicide research directly or calling for more HIV prevention options to be developed, or implicitly supported the idea of microbicides through arguments such as wanting to maintain the current research network structure, which includes the Microbicide Trials Network, or highlighting the importance of meaningful community engagement in the research process, or the need for social behavioral research, which people pointed out really highlights the need for microbicides and more options. So starting with the first theme, many respondents either explicitly or implicitly mentioned the need for HIV prevention choices or options. Several of the comments included references to the need for an HIV prevention toolbox, mentioned that one size does not fit all, or that different people have different needs at different times. And there were several explicit references to needing user-initiated, short-acting, and on-demand products such as microbicides in addition to systemic products, as well as comparisons to lessons learned from the contraception field. So some of the comments included some of the following, as you can see here, from a group of young women from Eastern and Southern Africa who said, we want choices, we're all different, we want different tools so we can choose what suits us best. And this quote from the letter that Jim mentioned from women's health advocates, the family planning field, has demonstrated time and again that providing women with a variety of methods to meet their needs and preferences results in greater product use and satisfaction and fewer unintended pregnancies. The same principles next slide, please. Comments included references to leveraging the success of the dapivirine ring and pursuing promising products currently in the research pipeline, including vaginal and rectal microbicides and multi-purpose technologies, as Jim mentioned. Concerns were expressed about the possible limitations of systemic approaches and the potential delays in the introduction of new products if alternative options are not pursued. So here are a couple of examples of the comments that we received, one from South African researcher saying removing the microbicide agenda doesn't feel like it's in the interest of providing a mix of tools for HIV prevention in young women. And the letter from U.S. legislators that Jim mentioned earlier stated it's foolish to put all our eggs in one basket or in one category of products. We need long-acting systemic products that don't require daily administration, just as we need topical on-demand products that don't require an intense clinical interface and long-term commitment. So next slide. There were a number of comments specific to specific products, including vaginal microbicides. It included references to the dapivirine ring and other potential vaginal rings and other topical formulations, such as gels, tablets, and films. So again, this group of young women from sub-Saharan Africa saying, we love the idea of the ring. We would use it because it's in and doesn't bother us for a while. We understand that DAIDS is thinking not to put more research into other forms of rings like this, and we don't think that's a good idea. Next slide. There were also specific mentions of rectal microbicides, including references to the various topical formulations in development, including douches, enemas, lubricants, suppositories. And here's one example of a comment from a researcher in the U.S. The desirability of an on-demand, behaviorally congruent, I'll come back to that idea later, PrEP product has been voiced loudly by the populations at greatest risk of HIV nationally and internationally, especially by young black men who have sex with men in the U.S. for more than 10 years. Rectal microbicide products now in clinical development demonstrate the capability to meet these requirements. Next slide. A number of people mentioned both vaginal and rectal microbicides, including all kinds of formulations. So another researcher in the U.S. who says, I'm concerned that the focus on systemic HIV prevention modalities compromises the very desirability that Dr. Diefenbach calls for, so the head of NIAID. For many, systemic products in any shape or form will never be considered desirable, especially in communities with significant medical distrust. In terms of desirability, microbicides, including rectal and vaginal microbicides, may very well be the most valuable HIV prevention tools currently under study. Next slide. There were also mentions of multi-purpose technologies, or MPTs, products that could prevent not only HIV but also unplanned pregnancies and sexually transmitted infections, or STIs, including this comment. As African women, we need more research in microbicides which can protect against pregnancy, STIs, and HIV at the same time. Next slide. So there were a number of product features that people commented as they submitted their input into this process that they thought were important for HIV prevention options. So many of the respondents mentioned the need for HIV prevention options that users, especially women, can control, including in cases where discretion is desired. Including this comment from Uganda, microbicides offer a very important opportunity to develop a woman-centered HIV prevention tool. Why kill an idea when you're still looking for an answer? Next slide. Another product feature was the desire to have short-acting products that can be used on demand at the time of sex, including the possibility of intermittent use during sporadic periods when the user is sexually active. So this is one example of a researcher from the U.S. who said systemic products under study, such as injectables and implants, will never meet the needs of people who want and need easy-to-use, on-demand tools that readily fit into their lives and do not require systemic application. Next. Another product feature was the desire to have non-systemic products that can be used without overburdening the user or the healthcare system, such as this commenter who said, we in Africa need a prevention package that can be empowering to the user and less dependent on a very ailing healthcare system. Next slide. And then I mentioned earlier that a number of people highlighted the need for products that are behaviorally congruent, meaning that they build on existing practices or behaviors such as rectal douching or the use of lubricants during sex, which would enhance their acceptance and uptake. So again, a researcher from the U.S. who said, although there have been difficulties in development of topical products, particularly with adherence, there are areas, including enemas, that are behaviorally congruent and hold great promise. We can't give up on this. Next slide. Many respondents mentioned the HIV prevention needs of specific populations, including pregnant and breastfeeding women, adolescent girls and young women, gay men and other men who have sex with men, transgendered men and women. So some of the comments are included here. One from advocate in the U.S. who said the black men and transgender men and women of color who are served by our organization want more options for HIV prevention. And someone from Zimbabwe who said invest more in microbicides so that more and more adolescent girls and young women are able to find a product that best suits their lifestyles, and we can ultimately contribute towards reducing the number of new HIV infections. Next slide. So there's several other themes that emerged from the submissions. Some expressed a preference for the NIH not to combine the existing HIV prevention networks. Some mentioned the need for the NIH-funded HIV prevention research networks to engage actively with community stakeholders, including underrepresented populations, trial participants, and community organizations. And this included some specific references to GPP, or good participatory practice. Some respondents mentioned the need to support social and behavioral research, including in relation to adherence, user preference, and epidemiology. Some respondents expressed the hope that NIAID would listen to civil society, community voices, and specific populations in various contexts that have an urgent need for an expanded range of HIV prevention options. And this included calls for greater transparency in the NIH's decision-making process, including making specific references to this request for input process. So the group of young women from Eastern and Southern Africa said, "We hope our views will be heard and considered because we don't want our issues to go unnoticed. We would love if in the future we were asked first about our needs instead of just coming with the products researchers think will be best and then asking us if we would use them." So next slide. So moving on to how NIAID responded to all of this input. We analyzed 56 responses from NIAID. Of these, there were 27 substantive responses to the submissions that we analyzed. The other 29 were responses that were just brief acknowledgements of receipt of input or requests for permission to post the submissions to the NIAID website, which actually we note never actually happened, and responses to submissions unrelated to the particular themes that we were looking at. So out of the 27 substantive responses we analyzed, there were 18 of them that were identical responses to the different U.S. legislators that signed on to the letter or submitted letters, which left 10 unique substantive responses, one to the legislators plus 9 others. So the first theme I want to highlight in what we saw is that of choice, which was the first one we highlighted for the submissions as well. So the NIAID responses stated that choice is fundamental to protection. They agreed with the idea of options, but said choice is not the endpoint. The tools must be effective. So this is one example of such a response from Carl Diefenbach, the head of NIAID. Developing choices for HIV prevention is a smart approach to protecting diverse people and populations. However, choice is not the endpoint to which we strive. As stewards of federal investment in HIV research, it is crucial that any prevention tool demonstrate a high degree of safety and efficacy in preventing HIV. So next slide. NIAID said it would support tools for disproportionately affected groups like young women, saying that women have been a blind spot and that they're now a top priority. NIAID said products were needed that can be used discreetly, but that also fully protect women, not only during vaginal sex, but also anal sex. So we can see here in the first orange quote bubble, developing safe, effective, and desirable prevention tools for women has been a long-standing goal of the NIH, and it's a top priority for the next iteration of the clinical research enterprise. And in the second, to be clear, NIAID will continue to support development of topical HIV prevention products. That said, we need a focused discussion on what it means to fully protect women from HIV. Is it sufficient to only protect women during vaginal sex when data indicate that rates of women engaging in vaginal and anal sex are increasing, especially for young women? Well, next slide. So here, we see that NIAID stated that due to fiscal constraints, they combined the HIV prevention trials networks. They stated that in any case, one broad prevention network will ensure that the most innovative, effective, highest priority prevention strategies are evaluated. And they state that this will also ensure that partnerships are built internally and with others like the pharmaceutical industry. And they said that such partnerships will help to move products to market and to implement them to scale, as you can see in the quote here. Oh, next slide. So this next theme is really critical, but it's a bit complicated. So please bear with me because we need to deconstruct this a little bit. So NIAID stated, as you saw in one of the previous slides, that they're not excluding microbicides, but the top priority is systemic protection. And they stated that they must invest wisely, which means in highly effective tools, and that they would support innovative, meritorious, promising concepts. So what does this mean? On the one hand, they mentioned in some of the responses that this includes a multi-purpose vaginal ring that would prevent HIV and unplanned pregnancies, as well as rectal douches. So those two things were mentioned. On the other hand, they indicated that microbicide research is limited, that there's a need for prevention options beyond what's currently being investigated, and that there's a need for innovation in the field. They stated that if innovation happens, they would consider supporting microbicides. However, they also asserted that microbicides have limited proven efficacy, that there's no proof that the most vulnerable groups would adhere to them, nor is there proof that they can provide systemic protection. And they said we need something that provides equivalent protection to daily PrEP, which, as we know, when used daily, provides nearly 100% protection. NIAID stated that it needs to invest smartly, and it's not looking for something to protect a fraction of the population. So this rather long quote here encapsulates a number of these points. As you'll see, there's no evidence to demonstrate that rectally applied product that lacks the ability to penetrate system-wide will be able to offer effective protection. However, while systemic protection is critical, systemic delivery is not mandatory. I do acknowledge your position that this position effectively eliminates microbicides research in its current state, but I think this field is in need of significant evaluation of what is currently desirable, practical, and provides protection equivalent to daily PrEP. The goal should not be to protect a fraction of the population. It should be to develop products that are highly desired, easy to use, and able to confer safe and effective protection. Next slide. Finally, NIAID said that there's no more funding available for community engagement and research literacy. This was in relation to a specific project called Be the Generation Project, which NIAID said complemented site and network level community engagement activities by laying the groundwork in reaching people in many of these communities and building research literacy and awareness. Funding is no longer possible to support that type of effort. So on that cheerful note, I'll hand it over to Jim and our community advocates to hear their perspectives, and then to Jim, who's going to share some of our thoughts and conclusions.
Thank you so much, Marc-Andre. That was awesome. And I know that was a lot of information, a lot of quotes, a lot of content. I will take a quick pause here and see if anyone wants to comment quickly or ask a question for clarification. And to do that verbally, you're going to unmute your phone by pressing *7. And of course, you can use the chat. So I'll pause, see if anyone's unmuting, pressing *7. Okay, we will have more time later, but now I'm really excited. You actually heard the voices, or Marc-Andre read some of the input from some of the voices you're going to hear from live and in person right now. That group of young women from Southern and Eastern Africa, we actually have 2 women who were part of that group who put in those very relevant and important comments that were essentially ignored by NIAID. So today we have Irene Hawari and Sinazo Peter on the call, and I'd like to invite Irene to unmute her phone by pressing *7, and we're going to meet her really quickly and hear her comments and thoughts. Irene, can you press *7 to unmute your phone?
She actually dropped off. I'm dialing back out to her.
Oh, okay, sorry. So how about Sinazo? Are you still there, Sinazo? Press *7. So *7 to unmute your phone. Sinazo? Are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, you're a little faint, but we can hear you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much for the invite as well.
Sure. So I'm going to ask you a couple questions, and we'll have a little chat. First, can you just tell us your name, where you live, and what your connection is to HIV prevention research?
My name is Kaala Pita. I am from Cape Town in South Africa, in a township called Philippi. I am connected in HIV prevention through Desmond Tutu HIV Foundation, which has groomed me a lot since I was in high school. So I've been their CAP member until today.
Okay, thank you. So can you quickly, we actually heard a lot of what you and the other young women said, but in your own words today, can you describe some of the key points of the feedback that you provided the NIH regarding HIV prevention research? Did you want to give us some of the things? Go ahead.
Sorry?
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I was interrupting you. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. We had a lot that we spoke about, and we came up with few points, and I think I think I have 2 or 3 points that spoke more about like Sunazo as me and other girls in South Africa, which we said we like the idea of a ring. Because, I mean, no one sees it. Not even your boyfriend can see it, you know. Because we always worried about something that you're going to insert it in your vagina and someone else is going to see it or someone else is going to have access to it. So we felt like it is much safer and it's painless, you know. So it's like, we said it's like our secret weapon, which that's what we like it most. And we have seen it work, you know. We have seen it working. I mean, there are studies that have been done, and also we've seen our friends. I've never had it, but I've had friends who had it. So, yeah. And the other point was that we want something that is more than injection, you know. Because some of us, we fear injections. We can't even go for contraceptives because we feel like injection is just way too much, and also going to the public clinics is just something else as well. When nurses are going to shout at you thinking that being sexually active at your age is something that is you need to be ashamed about. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Sunazo. Sunazo, can you tell us how old you are?
I am 25. I'm turning 26 next month.
Happy birthday in advance.
So, thank you.
Sure. So here's my last question before we'll move on to Irene. I think Irene has been able to join the call. But for you, Sunazo, to wind up, I just want to get your feelings about the fact that NIH has decided to no longer fund research into microbicides. So in other words, what is your reaction to no more funding in the future for things that are short-acting, user-controlled, used on demand, and are non-systemic? You talked a little bit about the hassle and the problems of going into the clinic to get a shot, having something that's controlled by the clinic. What are your feelings about this line of research going away?
I honestly don't feel good about it. I'm actually very disappointed on them because, I mean, I think HIV prevention and contraceptives or teenage pregnancy prevention, for me, I think they go together. So now if you're going to stop funding such great initiatives, I mean, where are we actually going with it, you know? Because, I mean, it was really helping. It is really helping, even with the sites. I mean, we feel more comfortable going to the search sites than going to the clinic. So now if there's going to be no funding, where are we going?
Thank you, Sunazo. I really appreciate your time this evening for you. So thank you. And if you wouldn't mind pressing *6 to mute your phone. And then I will ask Irene. I think you got back on, Irene. If you did, can you press *7 to unmute your phone? Are you here, Irene? Press *7 to unmute.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. So I'm going to ask you the same questions I asked of your friend and colleague, Sunazo. And again, I want to remind folks that that Irene was part of the group of young women and girls from Southern and Eastern Africa who supplied a lot of comments to the NIH regarding HIV prevention research priorities. So first, Irene, can you just introduce yourself, remind us of what your name is, where you live, and what is your connection to HIV prevention research?
My name is Irene from Zimbabwe. I'm 23 years old. I'm a PhD at Asia and I'm also a sex worker.
Thank you. And so can you describe some of the, in our slides today, we saw a lot of the things you all wrote to the NIH. But this morning, or actually for you this evening, in your own words, can you describe some of the feedback that you provided the NIH on HIV prevention research priorities?
Okay. About the feedback we provided, we talked about choice, and choice is the feeling that young women have when we know we have choices on how to protect ourselves. It gives us power within, and we get confidence. The power and confidence mean that there are less chances to become reckless about our reproductive health. Choice also frees us from slavery and any type, because we're able to say yes or no.
Thank you, Irene. And our last question for you is the same question I asked Sinazo as well. So you heard today and you've learned that the NIH is not interested in funding research into microbicides anymore. So in other words, they're not really interested in things that are short-acting, that are controlled by the user, that are used on demand when you need it, and aren't systemic, that don't go throughout your whole body. They just stay where the drug just stays where you put it. So in terms of the things you've said about choice and the things you all submitted, how do you feel about NIH's decision to no longer fund this type of research?
To be honest, I'm so ahead, because I'm mostly worried about young women and stuff that are at risk of getting infected with HIV. So knowing that the NIH has decided to stop supporting or stop funding most or all microbicide research in the next cycle, it worries me a lot. When I first heard about PrEP and the ring, I got so excited because I knew that I was going to create an HIV-free generation. So now that the NIH has decided to stop supporting this, now that the NIH has decided to stop funding, I don't know what it's going to be like, because I'm mostly worried about sex workers.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today, Irene. You can go ahead and press *6 to unmute your phone, and I will, acknowledge that we share your same worry. We're very concerned about this. It's why IRMA put out this report, Whose Choice Is It Anyway, last week, why we're having this webinar today, and at the conclusion of the webinar, we will be giving some ideas to continue to fight back, because this isn't over. This isn't over yet. And our community advocate voices aren't over yet. We have one more person who has joined the call today, Intando Yola. Intando, can you press *7 to unmute your phone?
Hey, Jim, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you. So we're the same drill. You should be used to it by now. We asked Sinazo and Irene. Just quickly say who you are, where you live, and what is your connection to HIV prevention research in Intando.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jim. And I think I must also really thank you all for this form of advocacy that really brings everybody together. And I think the sophistication, as I see it, of the ability to be able to really use some of the laws within the U.S. In how you've been able to really use the Freedom of Information Act to help us to have this conversation and to really solidify our advocacy. So really thanks to you and all the partners who are involved in this. My name is Ndando Yola. I am based in Cape Town with the Desmond Tutu HIV Foundation. And I work with really a lot of men at national, within Cape Town as well as at national level, doing community engagement in HIV prevention research, and also as part of that, intersecting community engagement activities with advocacy work. So that is where I am. Oh,
great. Thank you. So, Intando, I know you submitted feedback, or you were part of submitting feedback to the NIH during this process last year. Can you tell us, the highlights of the things that you provided to them regarding the future of HIV prevention?
So I think some of the very key things that framed my feedback was actually, informed by a lot of women, like, we have heard from Sinazo and many other women that we work with in really mobilizing communities as well as women and partner with them for HIV prevention research. And part of what, what they say is really exactly the things that Sinazo and Irene have highlighted in terms of having a good basket of tools that are really needed. And I think disappointing about the process is how it really didn't consider any of the voices of the people who have for the longest time. I mean, I think for the duration of the time I've worked in the field, which has been just over 10 to 13 years, we have been working with a lot of communities. And the message has always been, there is commitment by research and researchers as well as funding organizations to really make sure that we provide, there's a provision of a basket of tools for women, in different ways. And I think, the fact that there was just this decision that was made really didn't speak to a lot of things that we usually, we have for the longest time spoken about in terms of really respecting the communities and particularly in terms of the specific of the commitment that we've always had, especially from NIH, to really work with communities who really give a lot to make sure that the research agenda in its complexity and in its diversity, as well as providing multiple tools for different contexts that are affecting women. So my feedback was really framed within that and how disappointing the process has been.
I share with you that disappointment, both disappointment and anger, which is being fueled towards energy to change this story. This story hasn't ended yet, and hopefully we can make some change here by mobilizing. Is there anything else you wanted to say, Ntando, before we close out this section of the webinar?
No, I mean, I think one of the things in the past week I worked in a community which is in my home province, which is a rural province of South Africa, and we are starting some trials in those communities. So I was really working with a group of women, also presenting that, this is what we have, this is what is in the pipeline, and spoke about microbicides. So I think just a moment when one of the old women just out of the blue during my presentation just burst out and said, we are going to surrender. I mean, this HIV is going to surrender finally. And I think that was just a moment that was that really gave mixed emotions, in terms of really the hope that is out there. And given that part of the presentation really spoke about all the tools that are, spoke about PrEP and other, PrEP modalities or delivery methods, as well as spoke about microbicides, which I think has always been consistent in terms of the appreciation, especially by women, who around microbicides, because we've heard that. I think one of the best things about microbicides products, they work exactly where there is an issue, be it they are vaginal or rectal microbicides. And I think, to really cut short that hope, by NIH is, I think, I mean, it leaves us quite hopeless. But I think there is a lot of hope by, a lot of what, we are doing, led by our advocates, our fellow advocates who are in the U.S. So I am hopeful that, I'm hopeful to hear that there is still a lot more that we're going to make sure happens to really challenge power who are making decisions and who are really speaking against a lot of principles that we always speak about when speaking, to communities, because, they are speaking against respect because some of these approaches are very disrespectful. Mutual understanding and integrity as well as transparency are some of the things that are really lacking in how things are done. So whilst we, the situation is quite challenging, especially, for women in sub-Saharan Africa, but I think there is hope in what we can do as a collective of advocates.
Wow, that is well, thank you so much for saying all of that, and thank you for a perfect segue into the finale of this webinar. And I share your sense of, again, disappointment, and there is a feeling of hopelessness, but I want to encourage everyone on this call and all of our fellow advocates around the world who aren't listening today, but hopefully will listen later or read this report, Whose Choice Is It Anyway? This isn't over. It's not done, and there are things we can do. So, Ntando, if you have not already pressed mute, please go ahead and do that by pressing *6. And I want to thank again for hearing from these amazing advocates from Sub-Saharan Africa, Ntando, Irene, and Sinazo. Thank you so much. So if we can go to the next slide, the conclusion slide, and then there are some next steps. So let me get through this conclusion first. So as you all know, the NIH input phase has come to a close. Priorities for the next cycle of HIV prevention and treatment research from 2021 until 2027, and the new structure for prevention research, clinical trials networks, have all but officially been decided. Unfortunately, as our analysis demonstrates, they do not significantly reflect priorities expressed during the input phase by communities, advocates, and/or researchers from across the globe, nor by communities, advocates, researchers, and lawmakers within the U.S. Community concerns and priorities have been largely ignored. And I want to underscore this, largely ignored, even though there's a lot of discussion about creating things that we desire, creating things that we want, listening to communities. As Ntando so beautifully laid out, the kind of irony and hypocrisy of the statements like that coming from NIH, coupled with their actions that show little to no attention being paid. NIAID's responses to these comments are contradictory. While nominally espousing the language of choice and prevention options for women and other vulnerable groups, the NIAID responses demonstrate an uncompromising and patronizing stance towards microbicides and the development of tools that are specifically designed to meet the needs of those who are most vulnerable. And they belie a deep hostility towards those who call for that choice. In those responses, NIAID stated that they, quote, will continue to support development of topical HIV prevention products, end quote. At the same time, they provide a list of conditions under which that would need to happen, which include several complex, possibly scientifically unattainable criteria that by definition effectively exclude microbicides. This is disingenuous support. It's both cynical and it's hypocritical. We are particularly troubled to see that the letter submitted during the input process by the leadership of the HIV Prevention Trials Network, the HPTN, which will be the strongest or possibly only contender bidding to lead non-vaccine HIV prevention research, makes absolutely no mention of the intention to continue the work or incorporate the priorities and expertise of the Microbicide Trials Network. Indeed, there is no mention of microbicides or non-systemic on-demand products, and not a word about the need for options, choices, a range of tools to meet the needs of various communities. It is not too late to change or influence the priorities proposed by the NIH. We all must mobilize as a community of prevention consumers, advocates, researchers, and policymakers, and continue to voice the need for research that leads to an array of prevention options for those who need them most. In an era where the mantra is for options that fit people's lives versus those that people must fit into their lives, the current approach will not allow us to adequately respond to the HIV prevention crisis we face. To the NIH and the HPTN leadership, we say this: there is a vocal, aware, interested constituency for microbicides, and we are watching what you do. We will not allow our voices to be sidelined. There is way too much at stake, and after all, we're the ones with skin in the games. We're the ones who are vulnerable to HIV. The majority of people doing this research, you could argue, are not vulnerable to HIV, do not have skin in the game like we do. But all that said, we do look forward to working together as fully engaged and committed partners in a revitalized HIV prevention research enterprise that encompasses a broad range of potential options: long-acting and short-acting, systemic and non-systemic, user-controlled, and things that are delivered in the clinic, to meet our varied and complex HIV prevention and sexual health needs. Can we go to the next slide, please? So, after all that wind, we are going to act up and fight back. Please read this report and share it. If we can go to the next slide. We're encouraging folks to share it across all your favorite social media platforms, whichever they are. I recognize there's only 6 there, and there's about 8,000 more, so feel free to be promiscuous with your social networks. And we have a number of hashtags that we've come up with that could go with this report. So full toolbox, HIV prevention options, microbicides for all, user-controlled, user-centered design. We hear a lot about that. Our prevention choices, options for people's lives. We would love to see this go viral and be sent all over the internet. So please, please, please do that. And let's go to the next slide. And you can write NIAID, NIH leadership, and HPTN leadership. I think they should hear from you directly. So Dr. Karl Diefenbach, who we heard quoted multiple times, can be reached. He is in charge of NIAID. And his boss, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Sorry, I added an S there. I have no idea why I did that. There's only one Anthony Fauci that I know of, not 2 Anthony Faucis. Please feel free to write them and share your views, express your concerns, share your disappointment, and encourage them to listen to us, to listen to communities and researchers around the world. And please also reach out to the leadership of HPTN, Dr. Wafa Al-Sadr and Dr. Myron Cohen, both who are leaders of the HPTN and will likely be in charge of all the HIV prevention research that is not vaccines in the future. We need to let them know that it's unacceptable that their letter for input did not mention anything about short-acting and non-systemic, never mentioned anything about microbicides. We find that problematic, and we want them to do better. The networks haven't been refunded yet. It hasn't started. We're not at 2021. There is time to include microbicides. There is time to include choices for people. There is time to include all of that kind of research to move forward. So please feel free to reach out to them. And I want to encourage everyone globally to do that. But I also want to remind people here in the United States, we are taxpayers, and we pay for this. We are paying for the vast majority of this research that's done globally, whether it's vaccine, microbicides, other prevention options. It's coming out of the U.S. taxpayer dollars' pockets. So we have a say in this. So I think you should definitely take your rights as a citizen, stand up as a citizen, and speak to these leaders, speak to power, and let them know that your taxes that you're paying, you want them to be used in a certain way. So thank you for that. Now we do have a few minutes left, and we have some comments that I'm going to share from the chat. But I will also ask in these waning minutes if people want to say something verbally. Press *7 to unmute your phone and announce yourself. But there's a few things I want to share while if people are getting ready to unmute themselves and want to speak verbally. I have a few things from the chat I'd like to share. One of our listeners' questions, and I think this is a good question. When NIAID says they can't afford to create prevention methods for a fraction of the population, what do they mean? Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know. I don't think any of us know. It seems like they want to create something that will work for everybody, that we don't have to worry about the messy bits of vaginas and rectums. We just give everyone a shot. They've got systemic protection for months at a time, and boom, we're done. It sounds like that's where they think they're going to get a slam dunk. Never mind the fact that we know out of 100 women who start injectable contraception, within a year, 23 of those women are still using that modality. So I'm not sure what they're looking for, what percentage is not is insignificant or not, but I think it's a really good question, and perhaps that's a question that could be brought directly to Drs. Diefenbach and Fauci. Here's another comment I want to share. NIAID seems to have a deep-seated belief that people will not be adherent to on-demand methods. At the same time, PrEP advocates in France and elsewhere are moving PrEP use to on-demand for gay men. How much do you think that this idea that, quote, people cannot be adherent is actually about assuming women can't be adherent? I think that's another really great question. I can't answer for them. We can make assumptions about their opinions based on what they've said, their public comments, their comments that we analyzed through this process that's reported in the IRMA report that came out last week and we've talked about today. I think those are more questions to take directly to them, to these leaders, and ask them what they mean by that and what are their assumptions about people's ability to adhere. So looking through, I think here's another question. So someone asked us, is there any effort happening on the other side of the equation with the product developers? My understanding is that there has not been a lot of drug development work by pharma and biotech, so there is not a lot of microbicides coming along to be tested. Is there advocacy that can be done to encourage product development? I think that's a great question. I think that's a great point, and there's absolutely work going into reaching out to product developers. I know microbicide researchers have been doing this work. I think it's just important for us all to remember where the vast majority of these funds for this work comes from. The vast majority of these tools are funded by the NIH. PrEP was proven to work by the NIH. It was not proven by Gilead. NIH funded the clinical trials that brought PrEP to life. It wasn't the other way around. Gilead allowed us to use their drug, but that was the extent of it. So I think it's a very good question, and it's a question that we should definitely follow up on. But we need to hold NIH accountable, and their role in this, in leaders and product developers, is super important. Finally, let's see, we have someone mentioning the comment from Sinazo about the stigma linked to injections. It's important. It implies that the NIH would promote funding for options that will not be acceptable for people at risk. I think that's a really good point. So those are some of the comments that we got from folks. Can we go to the last slide? It's our acknowledgement slide. And while I'm pausing, taking a breath, is there anyone who wanted to add anything quickly while we're at the end of this call by pressing *7? Okay, so acknowledgements. I don't need to acknowledge myself. If we can go back to the acknowledgements, thank you. I want to acknowledge our project advisors, Danielle Campbell, Manju Chaitani-Gada, Anna Forbes, Lauren Gladowski, Ashley Randall, and a number of others. Our key author on the report, Marc-Andre LeBlanc. And special thanks to AIDS Foundation of Chicago's Lauren Gladowski, who was an intern at the time and now actually works for us as a full-time worker here. She's the one who managed to figure out how to get 330 pages of content into a word cloud program that spit out that gorgeous fist that you saw. That word cloud fist is actually, we didn't just sort of randomly put that thing together. We actually did that based on the input we got through the Freedom of Information Act request. There was a lot of material. It was really tricky because word cloud programs don't typically allow for 330 pages of documents to be inputted. So we had to do a number of processes that Lauren figured out on her own. There wasn't a guidebook. It was more trial and error. If you're interested, we have a little paragraph about exactly what she did in the report. So with that said, thank you all for being here. Thank you for sharing this time this morning. Please share that report, read the report, share the report. Reach out to us if you have ideas about advocacy. Share. If you've reached out to NIH leadership or HPTN leadership, please let us know. Please share that information. Please share what you hear back from them. We need to hold ourselves and everyone else accountable, and if we all want to continue to offer choices for people, we all need to be part of this solution. It's not going to work if a number of us are sitting back on the sidelines watching it happen. We all really need to step up, ask tough questions, and push our leaders to follow what scientists, advocates, policymakers, and end users around the world are asking for. So with that said, we're going to close the call. We will be sending out a recording of the call and making the slides available very soon. You'll get an email, and they will be, if you should somehow miss the email, you will go to rectalmicrobicides.org and click on teleconferences in the next couple of days, and that's where you'll see both the slides and be able to listen to this recording one more time. So again, thank you to all our presenters. Thank you to AVAC for co-hosting this with IRMA. And to all of you, have a great day and evening. Good day.